I never thought a fish-shaped mailbox would turn into a battle line. Yet there I was, standing at the edge of our gravel drive, staring at a bright orange metal trout with its mouth wide open, while a white envelope from the association fluttered in my hand like a warning flag. Buried in that envelope was one question that would swallow my next few months: would they really force us to tear it down and drown us in fines if we refused to comply? Our lakeside neighborhood looked calm from the outside. Boat docks, rocking chairs, manicured lawns, everything about it whispered quiet, safe, orderly. The water lay still most mornings, with only the faint wake of an early fisherman sliding across it. Underneath all that calm, though, there was a different kind of current, the one controlled by a handful of people who believed the neighborhood was their personal kingdom. That orange fish mailbox started as a joke. My kids loved to draw these cartoonish fish, and my partner had found this quirky metal mailbox online that looked almost exactly like one of their sketches. It was silly and bright and made delivery drivers smile. We set it near the road, a playful little landmark that screamed this house doesn't take itself too seriously. When the first letter from the board arrived, the air around me felt thicker as the afternoon heat pressed down on the cul-de-sac, and I could feel the start of something I didn't yet have a name for. Inside, the paper sounded harmless at first. It referred to a compliance concern and a reminder that all exterior fixtures must adhere to approved designs for consistency and neighborhood harmony. Buried in the third paragraph was the threat: failure to correct the violation within 30 days could result in fines and further action. It was delivered in polite language, but every line felt like a finger tapping my chest. They called our mailbox non-conforming. They said it clashed with the established aesthetic. That word, aesthetic, clung to my mind in a way that made my jaw tighten. It was a mailbox shaped like a fish in a lakeside community where people hung novelty signs and nautically themed decorations on their docks. Somehow, the fish crossed an invisible line the board had drawn. At first, I tried to shrug it off. I told myself it was a misunderstanding, a form letter, a glitch in the system. Maybe they meant to send it to someone else and typed our address by mistake. We had just finished unpacking boxes when we put the fish in, and the idea that this little joke might break some serious rule didn't feel real. But I knew the truth deep down. This was not about metal and paint. It was about control, about someone in a small office deciding what joy was allowed and what joy had to be painted black and bolted in a straight line. It was about people who woke up in the morning looking for something to correct. I folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. For a moment, I thought about yanking the fish out of the ground and replacing it with the standard black box everyone else had. That would have been the simple choice, the quiet choice. But as I looked at that smiling metal trout, I had another thought: if they wanted a fight over a mailbox, they were going to get one. They just didn't know yet what that would cost them. To understand why that tiny battle mattered so much, you need to know how we ended up in this lakeside maze of rules in the first place. We moved to Lake Cedar Ridge because we wanted slower mornings and softer evenings. I worked remotely, and my partner taught part-time at a community college. The listing for the house had promised resort-style living and an engaged, active residence committee. At the time, those words sounded charming, not ominous. The association here was proud of its documents. At closing, the title agent slid a thick binder toward us, full of bylaws and covenants and guidelines. There was a whole section devoted to paint colors, gutter materials, fencing heights, and, of course, mailboxes. The heading that stuck out, even then, was a page labeled CCR Section 4.3 Mailbox Rule, a section that described the standard black metal design mounted on a regulation post, with room for a single approved house number. Most buyers skim those documents. We tried to read them, or at least pretend we did. The language ran together in long, stiff sentences, full of heretofore and shall be deemed. But something in me registered that mailbox section. It annoyed me even then, this idea that the board had decided everyone's mailbox should look exactly the same. It felt like they were afraid of personality. But when you are signing your name a dozen times to lock in a mortgage, the theory of rules feels far away. The lake looked beautiful that day. The sun slid across the water in neat streaks, and the yard felt like a promise. We nodded along, signed the documents, and told ourselves we could live with a little uniformity if it meant quiet mornings and neighborhood block parties. The first time we met the association president, it was at one of those block parties. Her name was Ms. D, and she wore a visor, crisp khaki shorts, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She walked with the easy confidence of someone who believed the cul-de-sac belonged to her. She liked to mention, casually, that she had helped draft most of the current covenants. She reminded everyone that the board's job was to protect property values. Standing next to her was Mr. K, a thin man with sharp glasses and an even sharper stare. He introduced himself as the chair of the architectural committee. Where Ms. D wrapped her control in neighborly charm, he wielded his like a measuring tape. He liked to talk about compliance and enforcement provisions, and would mention certain houses by description, hinting at little flaws he wished he could fix personally. I remember feeling a faint warning then. Something in the way they watched the street instead of the people made me uneasy. But the burgers were good, the music was soft, and kids were chasing each other down the sidewalk. It was easy to push that feeling aside and tell myself we were overthinking it. The fish mailbox idea came later, after we had settled in. My youngest sketched this ridiculous fish one evening, with big eyes and a curved tail. My partner laughed and pulled up a picture of a novelty mailbox that looked suspiciously similar. It was painted a vibrant orange, with blue spots and a wide opening for mail. The kids begged for it, and we told them if they helped clean the garage, we would order it as a reward. When it arrived, we made it a family project. We dug the post hole together, lined it with gravel, mixed the concrete, and carefully set the pedestal. The kids got to hold the fish steady while I tightened the bolts. They stepped back, grinning, when it was finally mounted, like they had just planted a flag on the moon. We did think about the rules. I remembered that strict CCR Section 4.3 mailbox rule, but I also remembered the small map printed earlier in the binder, the one showing the property line stopping a few feet short of the road. I had asked the title agent about it at closing, and she had said the thin strip past the edge of the yard was technically right-of-way, not part of the deed. So we placed the mailbox on that small strip near the road. What felt like a trivial decision that day would turn out to be everything later. At the time, it was just a way to sleep at night. We told ourselves that if anyone complained, we could argue it wasn't on the property the association actually controlled. It was a flimsy reassurance, but it was enough to let us enjoy the bright splash of color by the roadside. At first, the reactions were fun. Delivery drivers slowed down and smiled when they saw it. Neighbors walking dogs would point and laugh. Kids on bikes announced that they loved the funny fish. A few older residents shook their heads but kept walking. For a short time, the mailbox was nothing more than a harmless oddity. Then, small signs started to appear. Mr. K walked past our house more often, sometimes twice a day, always glancing at the fish with that appraising look, the one you might expect from a building inspector, not a neighbor. Ms. D started mentioning at meetings that they needed to tighten up consistency now that new families were moving in. There was a subtle shift, like a cloud sliding in front of the sun that you almost pretend not to notice. The second envelope from the association was thicker than the first. It arrived a few weeks after we installed the mailbox. The return address was the management office, but the tone inside sounded like the voice of every rule-obsessed person we had ever met. They went beyond a simple reminder this time. They called our mailbox a violation of CCR Section 4.3 and noted that we had been previously informed that all fixtures must conform to the standard design. They gave us a deadline, 30 days to remove and replace the mailbox with an approved model, or we would face fines and potential further enforcement measures. That second letter was where the conflict truly began. The first note had been annoying, but this one felt like a direct challenge. It included a photo of our mailbox, printed in harsh black and white, with a circle drawn around it as if it were a problem in a textbook. It even had a highlighted line from CCR Section 4.3 mailbox rule, emphasizing uniform appearance and approved standard fixtures. I sat at our kitchen table and read it twice. The language was so stiff that it almost sounded fake, but the last paragraph made it painfully clear. If we refused to comply, they would start charging us $50 for each month that the violation remained, with the right to increase fines if the board deemed it necessary. It was amazing how something so petty suddenly turned heavy. A part of me wanted to laugh. We were talking about a mailbox, not a crumbling roof or a dangerous structure. The board was acting like we had built a neon sign. Yet beneath that, something else was stirring. It wasn't just about the fish anymore. It was about the idea that a handful of neighbors felt entitled to dictate every tiny expression of personality on the street. The next day, I pulled out the binder again. I spread the covenants across the dining table and flipped through the pages until I found the plat map that had shown our lot lines. The fine print at the bottom explained that the strip between the edge of the lot and the road easement belonged to the city, not to any individual homeowner. That meant our orange fish was sitting on land that technically didn't belong to us. I flipped back and forth between the map and CCR section 4.3. The rule talked about fixtures located on any lot within the association and structures placed upon or within the boundaries of a member's property. It never once mentioned installations on the right-of-way maintained by the city. It was a small gap, a thin slice of oversight, but it was real. This was the first moment I understood that the board's power was not absolute. They relied on people not reading, not questioning, not pushing back. Their control depended on the assumption that everyone would fold before the first letter even had time to gather dust on the counter. Once I saw that blind spot in their rulebook, the frustration took on a new shape. It became focus. I knew I was not dealing with a single person's opinion. This was the kind of setup you hear about in every HOA nightmare, where a harmless decision turns into a long war because somebody with a clipboard refuses to let it go. The fish had become a symbol, and whether I liked it or not, I had become the person standing behind it. The letter gave me 30 days before fines began, and I realized I had less than a month to decide whether I would cave quietly or test how far the association would go when someone refused to bend to their deadline. In the evenings, I watched the cul-de-sac. I saw who slowed down to stare at the mailbox, who sped past without a glance, who lingered near the entrance where the announcement board stood. Sometimes I would catch Mr. K pacing, holding a folder, glancing up at our house as if he was rehearsing an argument no one had asked him to make. I started to notice how the power structure in our little community actually worked. The board meetings took place once a month in the small clubhouse near the entrance. Notices were tucked into the bulletin board there, but most people walked past them on their way to the pool. The same handful of residents attended every time, the ones who spoke the loudest and acted like they represented everyone. They were used to people nodding, not challenging. They were used to enforcing rules through letters, formality, and the quiet threat of fines. They were used to the idea that they could label any small act of individuality as a problem and watch it disappear under pressure. As the 30 days ticked down, I felt that mixture of anger and curiosity growing. If their power was rooted in people obeying without question, what would happen if, just once, someone pushed back with the same energy they used to enforce their aesthetic vision? I did not know it yet, but the fish-shaped mailbox at the edge of our gravel drive was about to expose just how fragile their authority really was. I did not go to war right away. First, I did what the board always counted on homeowners not doing. I read everything. I made copies of CCR Section 4.3 Mailbox Rule and the plat map. I highlighted the parts that mattered. I even took photos of the mailbox from the street, making sure the edge of our lawn and the start of the right-of-way were clearly visible. It felt strange to document something as simple as a fish-shaped mailbox, but I knew that if the committee wanted a paper trail, I would have my own. I also started paying attention to how the board handled other issues. I watched how quickly they sent notes if a trash can lingered near the curb. I noticed how often certain houses got friendly reminders while others never did. Patterns started to emerge, and it became obvious that some residents were under a spotlight while others slipped by in the shade. My sense of the neighborhood shifted slightly, like a picture frame that had been hanging crooked the whole time. The next board meeting fell about 2 weeks after that second letter. By then, the late afternoon light came in low and gold through the clubhouse windows, and the folding chairs creaked as people sat down. There was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the rustle of printed agendas being shuffled from hand to hand. I took a seat near the back and watched Ms. D position herself at the center of the front table like it was a stage. The meeting started with the usual reports. They talked about landscaping contracts, dock maintenance, and social events. Then they moved to architectural compliance. I saw Mr. K straighten a small stack of papers in front of him, his eyes flickering toward the room just long enough to remind everyone he was the gatekeeper. When they opened the floor to homeowner comments, I stood. My heart beat harder than I wanted to admit, but my voice stayed even. I explained that my mailbox sat on the strip of city right-of-way beyond our deed line. I mentioned that CCR Section 4.3 mailbox rule referenced fixtures on a lot, not on public land. I kept it factual and calm, framing it less like a challenge and more like a question about how far the association's rules reached. Ms. D thanked me in that polished, careful way she had. She said they appreciated engaged residents. She said the committee would review the matter. Mr. K added that the purpose of the rules was consistency and that exceptions could not be made lightly. I watched his fingers tap the table as he said it. Their faces stayed neutral, but the tension in the room thickened. A few neighbors shifted in their chairs, suddenly staring at their agendas instead of at me. I sat down feeling two things at once. On one level, I was proud I had spoken up. On another, I could sense the board's quiet resistance. They did not like being challenged on the scope of their authority. They liked even less the idea that a homeowner might have read the documents as closely as they had. Over the next week, a few neighbors approached me casually. One told me they thought the fish mailbox was fun. Another mentioned that they had once wanted to plant a colorful hedge but had been discouraged by Mr. K, who had told them it did not fit the palette. It struck me that many people had small stories like that, tiny moments when their harmless idea had been nudged into conformity. They had shrugged and complied, telling themselves it was easier that way. The days rolled toward the deadline in that odd slow rush that happens when you are waiting for something you do not want. I kept expecting another letter, some sign that the board had listened, but the mailbox remained at the edge of our gravel drive, glowing orange in the evening light, and the association stayed silent. For a moment, I wondered if maybe they had backed off, if the reminder that we were technically on public land had made them rethink their stance. Then the 30 days ran out. The first fine appeared quietly, like a stain on a white shirt. Our monthly statement arrived folded in a bland envelope. Most of it looked normal: regular dues, reserve contributions. Then, down near the bottom, there was a new line. It said, "Non-compliance fine, mailbox, with an amount of $50 added to the total." The due date was noted in bold. There was no explanation, no note, just that single line. I read that line several times, feeling the air in the kitchen thicken as rain tapped lightly against the windows outside. They had not just threatened the fine, they had started it. The board had decided that our conversation at the meeting did not matter, that our argument about public land did not matter, that their interpretation of CCR Section 4.3 was the only one that counted. Attached to the statement was another letter. This one was headed, "Final Notice," dated May 12, even though it was the first time we had seen anything with that title. It stated that the association had determined our mailbox to be in violation, and that fines would continue each month until the violation was corrected. It also mentioned that unpaid amounts could be subject to additional fees and potential collection actions. They had escalated without ever acknowledging the loophole I had raised. They did not argue the plat map. They did not address the right-of-way. They simply declared the mailbox a violation and moved forward. It was like watching someone ignore a stop sign because they had decided it did not apply to them. I knew then that this would not resolve through polite questions. The board had shifted from reminders to punishment. They were betting that the prospect of paying extra every month would convince us to fall in line. They were also hoping, I suspected, that the rest of the neighborhood would start to see us as troublemakers, the people who refused to follow simple rules and made life harder for everyone. With every new statement, the fines would stack up, and the board was counting on money pressure to break us long before anyone realized how far they were stretching their authority to keep that fish from swimming on our street. I did something that changed everything next. I called the city. Not the association's management office, not Ms. D, not the architectural committee. I called the city's public works department and explained that I needed clarification on where exactly the right-of-way ended and homeowner property began in our neighborhood. I mentioned the mailbox only after the clerk pulled up the subdivision layout and confirmed that the area beyond our front stake line was indeed city-controlled. The clerk offered to send an email with a map and a short statement for my records. A day later, I had a clear picture showing the property line, the road edge, and the right-of-way, along with a note from the city engineer stating that installations on that strip fell under city, not association, control as long as they complied with basic municipal guidelines. I printed multiple copies and slid one into a clear plastic sleeve. It became my second key evidence prop, right after CCR Section 4.3. This was the moment when our situation stopped being just another HOA versus homeowner squabble and started to look like the setup to a full-blown HOA revenge story. I could see the outline forming, even if the ending was still blurry. The board had decided they were right. The city had quietly disagreed. We were standing in the space between those two facts, and that space was where our leverage lived. At the next meeting, the bulletin board near the clubhouse door held a new sheet. It listed outstanding violations, with lot numbers and short descriptions. Ours was near the bottom, non-conforming mailbox, ongoing. The paper was angled under the fluorescent light, and I watched a couple glance at it, then glance toward me as if they were trying to decide whether my fish-shaped mailbox was worth the trouble it was causing. The board had added a layer of public pressure now. They were not only charging us, they were also quietly broadcasting that we were out of line. It was subtle, but it was there, a little push meant to make us feel watched and judged by our own neighbors. I realized that if they were willing to stretch their power over a mailbox, they would not hesitate to do the same to anyone else who pushed back. What started as a silly decoration at the edge of our driveway had become a test of boundaries. Not just ours, but everyone's. As the fines continued, I refused to pay them. I mailed in our regular dues but left the extra 50 off each month. I wrote a short note each time, stating that the line item was disputed because the mailbox sat on city right-of-way, outside the association's property jurisdiction. I attached a copy of the map and the city's statement. Every month, I made sure they could not pretend they did not know. The response from management was always the same. New statements arrived showing the unpaid fine rolled forward, with small late charges starting to appear beside it. The tone of the letters shifted from polite reminder to firm insistence. They repeated that all fixtures visible from the street had to comply with association guidelines, expanding their interpretation of CCR Section 4.3 without ever admitting that the text itself did not say that. I kept everything. Every statement, every letter, every envelope with its printed date and postmark. I punched holes in the pages and placed them into a binder labeled mailbox file. In the front pocket, I slid the city's map and the final notice dated May 12th. The binder grew thicker each week, and with every new page, the story the board was writing about us turned into a story we were quietly documenting about them. The tension in the neighborhood rose along with the balance on those statements. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, not wanting to pick a side. Others gave small nods or half-smiles when they walked past the fish, tiny signals that they saw what was happening and did not entirely approve. There was a low, humming discomfort in the air now, like the distant sound of thunder before a storm rolls over the water. At the next meeting, I saw a new detail on the agenda. Down near the bottom, after new business, there was a line that read legal consultation, delinquent accounts and enforcement options. It did not mention us by name, but I knew exactly which line item had sparked that topic. They were considering how far they could go to collect on those unpaid fines, how firmly they could press without exposing just how shaky their position really was. By this point, the story was simple. We had installed a fish-shaped mailbox on the city right-of-way, the board had decided to treat it as a violation anyway, and instead of backing down when we showed them the map and the city's statement, they had escalated to fines, public postings, and talk of legal enforcement, all while we quietly built a binder of every step they took. What they did not realize was that in trying so hard to force us into compliance, they were giving us exactly what we needed to show how far they had drifted from their own written rules. That realization shifted something in me. I stopped feeling cornered and started feeling patient. This was no longer about scrambling to avoid the next letter. It was about letting the board show their true approach to power and then choosing the exact right moment to pull the rug out from under them. I reached out to a couple of neighbors I knew had their own stories with the board. One had been told to remove a small bench from under a tree because it was not approved outdoor furniture. Another had been cited for a garden flag that stayed up too long after a holiday. They had all complied, but a part of them still simmered. When I showed them the map and the city's statement about the right-of-way, their expressions changed from resignation to interest. This was no longer just our fish. It was a bright, metal symbol of how far the board was willing to go and how little they liked being questioned. And it was becoming, slowly, a rally point for people who had been quietly annoyed for years but had never expected to see someone stand firm and refuse to bend. The fines kept accumulating on paper, but we still paid only our dues. The mailbox stayed where it was, catching the afternoon light, a silent orange protest at the edge of the street. Every time I walked past it, binder in hand, I felt less like a rule breaker and more like someone waiting for the right scene in a drawn-out play. The transition from enduring to retaliating did not happen in a single moment. It started in small decisions, like how I organized the mailbox file, a binder, and how I made sure each tab told a clear part of the story. One section held the covenants with CCR Section 4.3 highlighted. Another had the plat map and the city's right-of-way statement. A third held every statement and notice, including final notice dated May 12, and a printed board agenda excerpt where legal consultation, delinquent accounts and enforcement options appeared. I began to think less about surviving each letter and more about how this whole chain of events would look from the outside. If someone neutral sat down with our binder, would they see a homeowner out of control or a board determined to stretch its power beyond its actual reach? I shaped the binder so that answer became obvious. Pages were ordered by date. Key lines were underlined. The contrast between what the document said and what the board did grew starker with every edition. I also noticed something else at the clubhouse. One day before a meeting, a draft agenda had accidentally been left on a side table. It was similar to the posted one but included handwritten notes. Next to non-conforming mailbox, ongoing, someone had scribbled, consider daily fine instead of monthly for impact. I did not touch the paper, but I memorized that line. It showed exactly how far they were willing to push. That night, as the sun sank behind the trees and the lake turned dark and glassy, I sat at our kitchen table and began mapping out a different approach. I listed out everything the board had done that depended on homeowners not knowing the details, misusing the term lot, ignoring the right-of-way distinction, escalating fines without addressing the dispute, posting violations publicly without mentioning that some were under challenge. I decided I was done playing defense. Instead of reacting to their letters, I would make them react to something they could not control, information. The more people understood about the right-of-way and the actual language of CCR Section 4.3, the harder it would be for the board to pretend their interpretation was the only one that counted. I printed a short, clear summary of our situation and the property lines, without mentioning anyone by name. I included a simple diagram of the right-of-way, the lot, and where a mailbox could legally sit according to the city. I ended with a line reminding residents that association rules apply to association property, and that questions about public land should involve the city, not just the board. I had not yet shown this packet to the board, but I knew that once it started circulating among neighbors, the committee that had been so focused on controlling a single fish-shaped mailbox would find itself under a much brighter spotlight than it ever expected, and the social fallout from that was only just beginning to take shape. Within a week of printing that packet, I found out who in this neighborhood was ready to stop shrugging. I did not stuff the packets into mailboxes. I knew better than to invite a different kind of trouble. Instead, I walked the street in the early evening, sliding them under doormats or tucking them between screen doors and door frames. I picked houses carefully, the ones with mismatched flower pots, the ones that had once had a garden flag that quietly disappeared, the ones where people had sighed when they mentioned the board. The reaction was not loud at first. It came in nods from across the street, in small waves from driveways, in the way people suddenly lingered a little longer near our fish-shaped mailbox as they walked past. A couple of neighbors started joining me at the back of the clubhouse during meetings, binder copies in their hands. The tension, once just between our family and the board, began to spread and shift. It was not chaos, it was awareness. The night everything tipped, the sky over the lake was turning that deep indigo that makes porch lights seem warmer. The agenda for the upcoming meeting had been posted, and for the first time, there was a new item near the top, member concerns, right-of-way installations. That phrase did not come from the board. It came from the form a group of us had submitted together, requesting dedicated time to address how the association handled anything off the actual lot lines. We had done it carefully. We followed the procedure listed in the covenants for homeowner requests, using their own structure instead of yelling from the sidelines. We avoided personal attacks and focused on definitions: what was association property, what was public land, and what authority the board truly had. By the time the meeting rolled around, there were more bodies in those folding chairs than I had ever seen before. The clubhouse felt different that night. You could hear chairs scraping, papers rustling, low whispers blending under the steady hum of the old ceiling fan. The fluorescent lights made everything look a little harsher than usual, catching tiny dust motes in the air. Miss D took her usual seat at the center, but her smile seemed tighter now, like it had to work harder to stay in place. Mr. K sat with his stack of folders, fingers drumming a little faster than usual. When they reached member concerns, right-of-way installations, I wasn't the only one who stood. Several of us rose together, each with our own copy of the map and the city's statement. I spoke, but this time, it was not a single voice pushing against the table at the front of the room. It was a chorus of quiet agreement behind me, a presence they could not brush aside as a lone troublemaker. We laid out the facts, calmly. The covenants defined their reach by the boundaries of each lot. The mailbox rule, CCR Section 4.3, repeated that language. The city's plat and the statement from Public Works made it clear that the strip where our fish sat was city right-of-way. We pointed out that fines had been issued anyway, that unpaid amounts had been rolled forward, and that an agenda excerpt showed the board considering more aggressive enforcement even after we documented the dispute. You could feel the mood in the room tilt. People shifted forward in their chairs. A couple of homeowners who had never spoken up before asked, in their own words, whether the board had been overreaching in other areas too. The question in the air was not just about my mailbox anymore, it was about power and trust. The board was suddenly facing something it was not used to, the possibility that their handling of this mailbox situation might not just look petty, but might actually trigger real scrutiny from outside the neighborhood if someone decided to put all this documentation in front of a city attorney who took jurisdictional lines seriously. For the first time since this started, I saw uncertainty flicker on Miss D's face. She tried to frame the whole thing as a misunderstanding, as an attempt to maintain consistency that had perhaps gone a bit too far. She talked about property values, harmony, and the importance of rules. But the more she leaned on those phrases, the more it emphasized how little she wanted to talk about the specific words in the covenants and the specific lines on the map. Then something small but significant happened. One of the more reserved neighbors, someone who had never made eye contact with me during any of this, raised a hand and asked if the board planned to rescind fines that were based on an incorrect assumption about its authority. The room went quiet in that heavy, waiting way where you can almost hear the air conditioning cycling on and off. It was a simple question, and yet it cut right to the heart of the story. The board did what boards do when they feel the ground shifting. They said they would review the matter, that they needed time to consult with counsel, and that they appreciated everyone's input. It was the same language they used to stall everything else, but this time, they were saying it to a room packed with people who now understood how the right-of-way worked. What they did not know was that we had already widened the circle beyond that room. One of the neighbors who had joined us worked in a nearby office that handled municipal records. They had quietly mentioned our situation to a friend who understood local codes. We didn't ask for formal advice, we simply asked a straightforward question: what happens when a private association tries to enforce rules on land controlled by the city? The answer was not complicated. It was not allowed. A few days later, a letter arrived, but not from the association. It came on city letterhead, addressed to the management company, with a copy mailed to us. The letter was concise. It acknowledged that an association within the city limits had attempted to enforce aesthetic rules on installations located within the public right-of-way. It reminded the recipient that regulatory control over that strip belonged to the municipality and that any attempts to impose additional private restrictions were not recognized unless approved through specific agreements, which did not exist in this case. The letter did not scold. It simply stated, in clear, bureaucratic language, that the city's position was that our mailbox, as installed, complied with local guidelines and fell outside the association's authority. It requested that the management company update its enforcement records accordingly. There were no exclamation points, no moral judgments, just the quiet weight of jurisdiction on paper. When the association's next statement arrived, the difference was immediate. The line reading, "Non-compliance fine, mailbox," had vanished. The accumulated balance of late fees was gone. There was no apology attached, no explanation, just the erasure of months of pressure as if it had never happened. The only clue that anything had changed was the small, clipped line in the newsletter mentioning that the board would be clarifying enforcement boundaries moving forward. The mailbox stayed exactly where it was. Our orange fish watched cars go by, its paint catching the late afternoon sun. But now, when people walked past, they did not just see a quirky decoration. They saw the thing that had outlasted the board's insistence, backed quietly by city jurisdiction instead of committee preferences. We could have ended it there. We had kept the mailbox, wiped out the fines, and exposed the limits of the board's reach. But the way they had handled everything, the letters, the postings, the willingness to threaten enforcement without acknowledging any error, had already done its damage. It had frayed trust, not just between us and the board, but between the board and the people it claimed to represent. That was when the conversation shifted again, this time to leadership. A group of us went back to the covenants and looked up how board members could be replaced. We discovered that the same documents the board loved to cite for enforcement also included provisions allowing homeowners to call for elections, propose new candidates, and vote for changes when enough people were dissatisfied. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but it was written right there, in the same stiff legal script they had used against us. We began asking around, quietly. Who would be willing to serve if there were open seats? Who had enough patience to sit through meetings without treating neighbors like offenders? Who understood that the association's job was to manage shared spaces and finances, not to micromanage every decorative choice? Slowly, names emerged, people who had always stayed on the edges but were now ready to step into the center. When the annual meeting arrived, the weather seemed to match the mood, thick air, heavy clouds gathering over the lake as if something was building. More homeowners showed up than the board had expected. The sign-in table backed up. Folding chairs had to be added in the back. Miss D tried to start the meeting with her usual polished tone, but she had to raise her voice a little over the murmur that kept rising and falling through the room like small waves hitting a dock. The election segment of the evening did not go the way the board expected. Instead of nodding through the slate they had pre-selected, homeowners nominated new names from the floor. People who had never spoken at these meetings before stood up and explained, calmly, that they wanted a board that focused on real issues, maintenance, budgeting, safety, instead of chasing down minor aesthetic variations on land it did not even control. When the ballots were counted, Ms. D's position was gone. So was Mr. K's. Their seats were filled by two of the people who had stood beside me over the binder, people who had read CCR Section 4.3 word for word and understood that rules should serve the community, not the other way around. There was no shouting, no dramatic scene. They stepped down, faces stiff, and the room simply moved on. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood felt different in ways that were hard to measure and easy to feel. The new board started by reviewing enforcement files, not to sweep everything away, but to see where lines had been crossed. They closed out bogus violations, including a few that had been bothering quiet homeowners for years. They sent a short, clear communication explaining the difference between lot property and city right-of-way, and they acknowledged, without naming names, that some past actions had overstepped. One of their first decisions was small but symbolic. They drafted a simple guideline acknowledging that decorative elements near the road, on public right-of-way, were not subject to association control as long as they met city standards. They encouraged neighbors to focus on safety and maintenance rather than uniformity. It was a subtle shift from "you must match" to "you must not create a hazard," and that difference bled quietly into everything else. The most satisfying moment came a little later, almost as an aftershock. The city, having reviewed the area after our inquiry, noticed that the association's own monument sign near the entrance slightly encroached farther into the right-of-way than it should have. It was not dangerous, but it was not where it was supposed to be. A polite notice went out requesting that they adjust it to comply with municipal setbacks. The irony was sharp but quiet. The same organization that had tried to force us to move a mailbox off land it did not control now had to spend board funds to adjust its own sign on land it did not own. There were no public celebrations, but people noticed the construction tape, the temporary absence of the stone sign, the way it reappeared a few feet farther back. The story traveled in low, satisfied tones across driveways and docks. Our fish-shaped mailbox remained untouched throughout. The kids still pointed it out to friends. Delivery drivers still slowed down, amused. Neighbors who once hesitated to wave now stopped to talk about weekend plans or ask about the plants along our walkway. The mailbox had gone from a target to a landmark, from a non-conforming fixture to a quiet symbol of where the board's power ended and our autonomy began. I sometimes walked past it at dusk, when the last light of day brushed the metal scales and the lake reflected the fading sky. In those moments, I thought about how easily this story could have gone another way, how simple it would have been to pull the fish out, bolt a standard black box to a post, and let the board's version of order roll on unchallenged. We would have saved ourselves months of letters, meetings, and slow-burning frustration. But we would have lost something else. We would have lost the reminder that rules are not meant to be weapons, that authority has boundaries, and that sometimes the smallest battles, over a mailbox, a bench, a garden flag, are where a community decides who it truly belongs to. We never asked for an apology. What we got instead was something better, a board that knew it was being watched, homeowners who had learned they could read their own documents, and a neighborhood that had seen, firsthand, how measured resistance and patient documentation could turn a petty power play into a lesson about limits. The orange fish still waits at the edge of our gravel drive, mouth open, ready to catch the day's mail. Every time I walk past it, I remember that this whole thing started because someone saw a harmless bit of whimsy as a threat to consistency. In the end, what it really threatened was the idea that a few people with titles could decide, unchecked, what everyone's lives should look like. Tell me your boldest mailbox power struggle in one sharp sentence.